still a gap. It's still a gap that we deal with on a daily basis in our advocacy stream.
Tonight, a new report from Manitoba's Child Advocate told through the lives of youth.
I also want to take some time this afternoon to apologize. I said something on Monday's press event that I regret.
And the Nunavut Premier recants remarks made about laid-off teachers from the South coming north. Good evening, welcome to APTN National News. I'm Dennis Ward. The Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth released her latest report today. In it, the Advocate profiles the lives of 22 female youth who died by suicide and outlines the lack of mental health and addiction services for youth in rural and remote areas. Brittany Hobson has this story and a warning to viewers. Some may find this content disturbing.
To the public, they are known by pseudonyms such as Madison, Jasmine, or Dawn. But to family and friends, the 22 females profiled in a new report on suicide were casualties of failing systems. The Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth released her latest report titled, "Stop Giving Me a Number and Start Giving Me a Person." In it, Daphne Penrose examines the barriers these youth faced prior to their deaths.
These investigations are critical so we understand the gaps and so that we can amplify the voice and experience of children and so that the public knows about what those services are providing to their children.
Penrose says suicide is the leading cause of death for youth in the province. Since 2008, 159 children and youth between the ages of 9 and 17 have died by suicide.
The stories shared in this report all weave a similar tale. Early instances of childhood trauma leading to mental health or addictions issues. 2 years ago, the province committed to addressing the need for more or easier access to services. But to date, Penrose says more needs to be done.
We still have not seen a strategic plan for how child and youth mental health and addiction services are going to move forward. It's still a gap. It's still a gap that we deal with on a daily basis in our advocacy stream.
Penrose makes 7 recommendations in the report, including access to services across all areas of the province, early childhood trauma education for service providers, and the development of more youth hubs in remote and rural areas. 20 out of 22 of the youth profiled were First Nations or Métis, with more than half from northern Manitoba. Penrose says there is a clear lack of services in these communities.
Well, the help they received while in hospital or in treatment was good. The problem was they didn't have a person to help them navigate to the community and or community services when they returned back to their community.
First Nations leadership is calling for more culturally appropriate services. In a statement, Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs Grand Chief Arlen Dumas said, "The provincial and federal governments continue to ignore First Nations solutions resulting in this tragedy. This has gone on for far too long." Penrose hopes the report enacts real change.
If this doesn't, I don't know what will.
Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
To Montreal now, where police are being accused of mishandling a crisis situation involving a Cree woman. It's not the first time that intervention workers have spoken up about how police deal with vulnerable Indigenous people in the city. Tom Fenario has more.
David Chapman is the kind of guy people reach out to when they need help. Part of it is his gregarious disposition. Part of it is because it's his job. On Sunday, the intervention worker had a client in crisis.
I could see that she was not well. I mean, she was holding 2 broken beer bottles. She was talking about ending her life.
Chapman works for the Resilience Center, a day shelter for homeless Indigenous people. During the pandemic, he's been working out of this downtown public square. It was in front of this church that he spent hours talking to a Cree woman in crisis. Eventually, he convinced her to let him call an ambulance. But he got a different response.
Police cars started arriving, one right after another. And it was at this point that the woman actually picked back up the broken beer bottles. So she'd actually put them down. And she was in a posture of wanting help. But when all the cars started coming, and they just came one right after another, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, they just kept coming.
Bystanders tell APTN they counted 17 police officers in total, along with a canine unit.
The dogs, I don't know what they were thinking there. I'd love to find out why they thought they needed dogs. A woman is in crisis. A woman, is at the edge, and you send 17 police. So it is overkill.
Nagusset is the director of Native Women's Shelter of Montreal, where the woman who was in crisis is currently staying. She made a complaint to Montreal police over their handling of the incident. Police declined to be interviewed for this story, saying that they're aware of the incident and that they're looking into it.
Okay, I've heard that before. We're still waiting for them to, look into Mina's incident.
Nagusset is referring to Mina Akuliak, who went missing for nearly a week after she was released from jail in the middle of the night in an industrial part of the city with no escort. That was in 2018. For his part, Chapman says that some police presence is necessary for crisis interventions. He adds that no one was harmed, an ambulance did eventually come, and an officer did make an effort to negotiate with the woman. He says he still worries what might have happened if he had not been there.
To see a commitment from the police about what the actual change of protocol will be, and then some proof that those changes are actually being made.
If you or anyone you know is experiencing suicidal thoughts, call any of the numbers listed on the screen. Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Montreal.
Out of Ottawa today, updates on military support for Indigenous communities during this pandemic, and new COVID-19 tests and mental health resources. Jamie Pasha-Gumscum has the latest.
National Defence Minister Harjit Sajjan said today the Canadian Rangers have been supporting Indigenous communities in northern Saskatchewan and Nunavut, and in Nunavut, where they help transport COVID-19 test swabs in response to a shortage.
They're educating people about physical distancing, supporting the work of healthcare personnel, and assisting with the delivery of community-owned supplies.
At the COVID-19 committee briefing, Chief Public Health Officer Teresa Tam said a different kind of COVID testing is being used in some Indigenous communities.
For example, we're particularly interested in northern Saskatchewan right now, and they have this test called a Gene Expert, which they can do close to where the outbreak is happening in the sort of La Loche area, for example.
Tam said the Gene Expert test has proven useful in areas far from laboratories, and she says more tests are on the way. Tam also announced mental health supports and a hotline for children and youth. She said some communities have been involved in the development of the resource.
Absolutely, this is extremely important. Anything that we provide should be culturally appropriate, and that is in consultation with the communities. But I do know that some of the available tools or materials have been developed by individual communities as well.
Tam said while kids are missing their friends, maintaining virtual connections reminds us all that we are not alone. Jamie Pasha-Gumscum, APTN National News, Ottawa.
And we'll have more out of Ottawa later in the show when we sit down with Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller. Coming up, why the Premier of Nunavut is apologizing. Stay with us.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran, and here's who we'll have for you on Nation to Nation. We speak to an advocate for seniors living in long-term care facilities. But she's trying to help a disabled 27-year-old woman who identifies as Ojibwe and who is stuck in a home for the elderly during this COVID crisis. As well, we heard earlier this week about a federal program to buy back surplus food going to waste. Tanya Cameron is from Kenora and has been doing her part already, brokering deals to get surplus potatoes into vulnerable communities like remote First Nations. That's coming up right after the national news.
Here's a look at Friday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. 8 with showers in St. John's, rain and +5 for Halifax. 2 with rain in Nain, snow and +2 for Cartwright. 9 with showers in Montreal, snow and a high of 5 for Saguenay. Snow and 5 for Toronto and Ottawa, +1 in Sault Ste. Marie. 8 above with snow for Thunder Bay. +4, and flurries for Sioux Lookout. Sunny and 6 above in Thompson and Norway House, 3 in God's Lake, +7 under sunny skies for Winnipeg and Gimli, 10 in Brandon. 15 with showers for Regina and Estevan, 13 in rain in Saskatoon, 11 in showers in Meadow Lake and Buffalo Narrows. Welcome back. Last week, the government of Nunavut announced a key change to a program they have spent over $2 million on since the beginning of the pandemic. This week, a complete reversal, with the Premier apologizing to teachers. Our Kent Driscoll tells us what happens when the Premier gets called to the principal's office.
Since March 24th, residents returning to Nunavut have had to spend 2 weeks in a quarantine hotel before flying back to the territory. The government has been picking up the tab, and it's cost $2 million so far. Last week on Friday, the government changed their stance. Anyone leaving the territory voluntarily would have to pay for their own quarantine to return, which runs just over $2,000 for the 2 weeks.
It's not a government responsibility to pay for isolation for those who choose to leave despite advice from the Chief Public Health Officer.
Many of Nunavut's teachers were already upset with the government. 90 of them left Nunavut after the schools were closed. Only 25 of those 90 came back when ordered to by the government. Lots of Nunavut's teachers spend the 2-month summer break in the south. I asked the Premier if he was concerned that upset teachers could lead to trouble recruiting new teachers for September. Nunavut did start this school year short 60 teachers.
And there was an announcement earlier in the year where Ontario was going to lay off a whole bunch of teachers, so maybe these teachers might want to come and work in Nunavut.
The head of the teachers union says many of his members have been in the territory for a long time. They didn't think that quip was funny. Not at all. Some long-term teachers are quitting because of the perceived treatment by their employer.
And then you have the Premier go on a press conference and he just underlines that ill treatment with a flippant comment like that. So we were very disappointed. We hope the Premier has a chance to retract that statement.
And did he ever retract that statement? This is the Premier 2 days after his quip about laid-off Ontario teachers coming north.
I also want to take some time this afternoon to apologize. I said something on Monday's press event that I regret. My comments about the recruitment of teachers was careless and dismissive. There is no reflection on how much this government values teachers.
He didn't just apologize. The government scrapped the entire idea of making people pay for their own quarantine. Residents are still being urged not to travel, but they won't have to pay for their own lockdown if they do. Nunavut remains the only part of Canada without a single case of COVID-19. Maybe that fact will help recruit teachers for the next school year. Kent Driscoll, APTN National News, Iqaluit.
Well, following a COVID-19 outbreak in a Montreal jail, Quebec says certain low-risk inmates nearing the end of their sentences can apply for early release for medical reasons. 34 detainees at Bordeaux Jail in Montreal have COVID-19. Several guards are also infected. Public Security Minister Genevieve Guilbeault says inmates with less than a month to serve can apply. Speeding up the process will ease strain on the system, she says, but no one with a violent history will be released.
Et d'ailleurs, ces permissions de sortie à des fins médicales, ce ne sont pas des mesures spéciales qu'on a créées pour la COVID. Ce sont des mesures qui existent déjà dans la loi sur les services correctionnels. Simplement, on adapte cette notion-là à la situation exceptionnelle qu'on vit depuis le début de la pandémie.
As of Wednesday, Indigenous Services Canada is reporting 164 confirmed positive cases of COVID-19 on First Nations. The pandemic also comes at a time of annual spring flooding for Saskatchewan. For more, we're joined by the Federal Minister of Indigenous Services, Mark Miller. Minister Miller, thanks for joining us. There was initially $305 million allocated through the Indigenous Communities Support Fund. Has all of that money now gone out the door, and is there more relief planned?
It has, Dennis, and recall for listeners that this was very much an emergency source of money to be deployed in the fastest way possible into communities. So through existing channels directly into First Nations or through the treaty organizations and ITK or directly to Métis land organizations across the country. Very much a bit of an imperfect science, but the objective was to get it out as quickly as possible so that communities that were vulnerable and in need of financial backing of the Government of Canada could have it as quickly as possible. So yes, I think viewers or listeners may have seen the announcements with respect to business supports specific to Indigenous communities that we rolled out a little over a week ago, plus about $75 million to students to bolster post-secondary Indigenous students, in particular, in addition to the other measures that are available to all Canadians. So we don't know, and we don't have a clear profile of how, when, and to what degree this will impact communities, and for how long, especially. So absolutely, there will be more to come.
Of course, the other big issue out there right now is the flooding that's taking place. How's your department ensuring Saskatchewan gets the emergency shelters and other supplies requested, and will that include any military support?
Well, particularly if we look at last year, my department is one that is getting very used to working on an emergency basis, for better or for worse, frankly. That allows them to develop a certain muscle memory and react quite quickly. Now, COVID-19 is an emergency and a pandemic of a completely different order. So when we see the seasonal flooding, which is traumatic for any community, compounded by the fear and potential impact of COVID on a community, it certainly makes the planning much more complex. So in the specific example, which is top of mind to me and for most Canadians, Saskatchewan, Plan A, which was the preventive evacuation of community members for the last several years, is very much Plan C now. And Plan A is support for community members that choose to go on the land, as well as helping people stay in place and monitor on a constant basis, whether it's flyovers or direct monitoring, the level of the water as it breaks up during the season.
Is military support being offered, though?
We have 5 rangers in place, and any support and availability of resources is not the issue. We have to work with a pandemic plan and an emergency plan layered together to make sure that the resources are appropriate for what the requests are. And right now there are 5 rangers from the community in place, and we're prepared to deploy additional resources, evacuation resources, medical resources, which we've bolstered, obviously, given the pandemic. And so it really is an issue of availability of resources. We will bring all resources to bear should and when the need is there.
Of course, because of the pandemic, some communities who would typically host evacuees have said no this time around. Have any First Nations or municipalities been identified to host those in a state of emergency?
Yes, and bear in mind we're talking about fewer potential evacuees this time, and it is not preventative. It would be in the case that there is real alarm with respect to the level of the water. You know, and I would also say, to your point, vice versa. There are a number of community members with real fear and apprehension to going into communities, contracting COVID, and then potentially bringing it back into the community. So that is one of the very fine considerations that we're working with Chief and Council to make sure that any evacuation is done with extra supports into a community, so that members can be properly supported, so that their isolation protocols and the distancing protocols that we're asking all Canadians to observe, but we're particularly sensitive to when you're talking about a mass displacement of a population, the risk becomes much more acute. So we have identified a number of potential sites, but again, this is something that evolves on a day-by-day basis, and in fact, I'll be speaking to Chief Friday shortly about that today.
Today, Dr. Tam announced mental health programs for children and youth, including a Kids Helpline. Are there areas in those programs specifically for Indigenous youth that are culturally appropriate or offered in Indigenous languages?
Well, you know, it's an excellent question, and I would specify and draw to the attention of a lot of listeners that have perhaps availed themselves of these resources that there has been increased demand on the resources that we offer under Jordan's principle, particularly for to address these situations. Obviously, the physical distancing and people staying at home, as well as the real apprehension with respect to COVID, has created a number of concerns and stress with respect to mental health. And so we have seen additional pressure on the funding that we distribute according to Jordan's principle, and the government stands ready to support even more. On the educational side, people studying at home, etc., will need additional resources, and we stand ready to support them as well.
Minister Miller, we'll have to leave it there. Appreciate you taking some time for us.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Now, the chief of Saskatchewan says people in the Cree community are bracing for flooding at any time. Leo Friday told APTN News that the spring breakup is expected to start any time now, along with the flood risk that comes along with it. 800 people are still in the community while the rest are on the land. Time for a quick break, and then we'll see how Indigenous artists could be stepping in to help the Ontario government with needed protective equipment. Stick around. Here's a look at the rest of Friday's weather forecast. Picking back up in northern Alberta, sunny and 17 for Peace River, showers and 16 in Fort McMurray. Same deal in Medicine Hat, 16 above with rain, 10 in showers in Calgary. 22 under the sun in Vancouver, Campbell River and Bella Coola. Sunny and 20 in Smithers and Fort Nelson, 17 in Prince George. 11 above under sunny skies for Old Crow, 19 in Whitehorse. 18 under the sun for Fort Liard and Trout Lake, plus 5 with flurries in Yellowknife. Snow and -9 in Sax Harbor, plus 3 for Inuvik. -6 in Repulse Bay, 7 below in Chesterfield and Whale Cove. -14 in Resolute, 10 with snow in Glue Lake. Welcome back. The province of Ontario may be looking at employing Indigenous artists to produce personal protective equipment. During a call with leaders in the province Tuesday, Premier Doug Ford suggested Ontario work with First Nations to produce hospital gowns. Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians Grand Chief Joel Abram said he will follow up on the idea.
But I did. I said, "Are you serious about this?" And he said, "Yes, dead serious." And I've seen some of the work that First Nations craft people do, and I know it's right up there among the best. So why not utilize that skill set and start producing PPE, because we really need that, So I think that maybe that's an odd kind of match, but, if people are willing, if he's willing to provide the materials, there seems to be a lot of people willing to pitch in to help out with that, I think.
Could turn out to be a long-term business. That's all the time we have for your APTN National News for this Thursday. For much more, visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in. Stick around. Nation to Nation with Todd Lamarand is next. Have a great night.